Michelle, twice divorced and recently out of a controlling relationship, wasn't interested in dating. She didn't feel confident she could evaluate a man's true character after choosing poorly 3 times in a row. And she found the single lifestyle quite enjoyable. Find what horror awaits her when she guesses wrong again. Welcome to the Spine Thrills channel, where your nightmares come true. But George seemed different. She'd met him at the local library, of all places, and they'd had a pleasant conversation. He'd never been married, was studious and reserved, and socially awkward to the point of a full-on nerd. It was almost charming. His physique wasn't bad, but he was kind of thin and lanky, and did not give off a very masculine impression. It made him seem non-threatening. Like she'd be the one to protect both of them should conflict or danger arise. He was definitely not her type, but Michelle's type hadn't worked out so far. So, when George asked her out to dinner, she agreed. Why not? She could kick his ass if he got out of line. She figured the occasional friendly date might be nice. Michelle drove to the restaurant separately. George was practically a stranger, after all. Throughout dinner, George maintained a polite but distant air. He asked Michelle a lot of questions, offering only tidbits about himself. He was a dry academic and called himself an expert on human behavior, a topic Michelle knew little about. Although George appeared to be a kind man, there was no emotional or physical spark. George didn't make romantic overtures either. It wasn't long after the meal that they called it a night. Thanking the server as they left, George walked Michelle to her car and politely opened the door. She got into the driver's seat and closed the door, then smiled at him with a wave through the window as she prepared to drive away. And that's the last thing she remembers. When Michelle awoke, she was suspended in the air, hanging painfully by her wrists. She felt cool air across her bare skin and realized she was completely naked. It took her a moment to grasp her surroundings. She was dangling inside what looked like a massive fishbowl, her feet only inches from the bottom. The odor inside her glass cage was putrid, a combination of foul-smelling chemicals and rotting decay. She couldn't escape breathing in the morbid air and tried not to gag as her eyes burned. She peered through the prison glass and saw 3 other fishbowls lined up in a row. They each contained women in her same situation, hanging by their wrists, naked, weeping, and petrified. Moving her eyes upwards, Michelle observed groups of thick piping running along the ceiling. Each section of the pipe led to a gargantuan barrel above each fishbowl. As she watched the barrel directly above her swing disturbingly side to side, she realized the horror of her predicament. She let out a nightmarish scream, demanding that her captor release her, tears streaming down her cheeks. But her screams only bounced around the confines of her prison, muted and faint to the outside world. No one could hear her. Suddenly, she heard George's voice come through a speaker system. He announced phase 1 of his experiment. Michelle immediately noticed the enthusiasm in George's voice. He sounded almost giddy as compared to their dull conversation at dinner. The pipes on the ceiling started vibrating, then clanging and rattling as a gush of fluid rushed through them. Michelle writhed and twisted her body, her heart pounding, the ties around her wrists ripping at her skin. She stared wide-eyed at the barrel above her head as she tried to escape. But then she caught the movement of a barrel above another fishbowl. It began swinging wildly, then tilting precariously until a golden liquid spilled over. She let herself breathe a sigh of relief. It wasn't her barrel. As she watched what was happening to the woman, a large neon sign on a wall blinked to life. It displayed the terrifying words, "Hot oil." That poor woman screamed in agony, thrashing around desperately as the blazing oil filled her fishbowl inch by inch. The skin on her feet had burned away, leaving only bones. But the woman was still alive. Michelle's wide eyes watched in sheer horror as the level of the oil rose higher and higher up the woman's body, scalding her flesh beyond recognition. She was literally cooked alive. Finally, the woman stopped her unbearable wailing and shrieking. She hung there, a skeleton of burnt scraps of flesh, blissfully dead. The hot oil continued to rise, consuming her face, searing her skin and hair into fried bits of crusty remains. The ceiling pipes shut down. Michelle heard the drip, drip, drip of hot oil still leaking off the side of the barrel. Mortified and terror-stricken, Michelle vomited repeatedly. She sobbed as she accepted her awful fate. She was more afraid of the pain than of death itself. Still, she wasn't ready to die. She'd just started living, and that snapped her back to reality. A fierce anger rose inside her. In a rage, she kicked her legs and started swinging her body like a pendulum. Maybe she could climb out. Despite her efforts, her feet couldn't reach the fishbowl sides. Blood from the wounds on her wrists and panicked sweat trickled down her neck. Michelle tried to control her panic. There's always a way, some chance of escape from any situation, even if it's a long shot, right? Her mind raced as she considered her options. She refused to be defenseless. Just then, George's voice echoed through the warehouse again as he announced phase 2 of his entertaining experiment. He chuckled this time as the machinery whirred, the pipes rattled, and the second barrel filled. This time, the neon sign on the wall announced the viciousness of sulfuric acid. It was colorless, like water, but the screeching, suffering woman made it obvious the liquid was deadly. She slowly disintegrated before Michelle's eyes, an appalling and cruel acid mist rising from her dangling corpse. Michelle tried again to swing her body, flailing her legs in every direction in the hopes she could reach the glass sides. When that didn't work, she focused all her concentration on lifting her body straight up. Her arms burned as she asked her muscles to bear her weight. With her head finally even with her wrists, she bit ferociously at the rope ties, trying to chew through them. But she couldn't hold her body up long enough to make any progress. George announced phase 3 of the experiment and turned on the flow of the next deadly liquid. The neon sign boasted Pier Anna. Oh my God, flesh-eating fish. At first, the fishbowl began filling with only water. The woman, though crying hysterically, was unharmed. Once the water level rose just under her chin, the water stopped, and another pipe opened. The barrel filled, tipped, and then dumped dozens of piranhas into the tank. The razor-toothed fish didn't waste any time. The woman was attacked by one, then another, and then a dozen more. Their open mouths revealed sharp triangular teeth that met together in a scissor-like bite. Chunks of human muscle and tissue floated in the water as it turned a bloody red. The woman screamed mercilessly as the fish fed ravenously on her feet, legs, buttocks, arms, hands, chest, neck, and face. Even when the repugnance of being eaten alive was over, the Pier Anna continued to feast. Soon, there was not a morsel of flesh remaining. Utterly distraught, Michelle had no choice but to prepare for excruciating pain and death. She also recognized that each fishbowl torture seemed more horrific than the last. And she was next. George was whistling cheerfully over the speakers. His voice was whimsical as he declared that phase 4 of the experiment was about to begin. The machines hummed, the pipes groaned, and Michelle's barrel started leaning heavily to one side. She prayed silently for a quick death, then closed her eyes. The first drop hit her shoulder. Then she felt a burst of liquid cascading down her body. Surprisingly, she felt no pain. So, survival mode kicked in. She lifted her body, raised her feet, and curled her legs under her. Her goal was to avoid the liquid as long as possible. She felt her calves cramp and then her thighs. After a couple minutes, her abdomen muscles quivered in pain. Soon, her entire body was shaking uncontrollably as she mustered all her strength to hold herself high above the dangerous flow. But why? Why was she prolonging the inevitable? Michelle made a last-minute decision to just let it all happen and accept her fate. Her body wouldn't hold out anyway. Terrified, she squeezed her eyes closed, said a prayer, and extended her legs into the fluid. Then she let out a hair-raising scream, and her world went black. Michelle awoke to the dripping of ice-cold fluid on her face. Slowly, she opened her eyes. Straight above her, the barrel was level and steady, draining the last of its liquid demise. But, confused and disoriented, she realized she was still alive. Her wrists were throbbing as she wiped the hair out of her eyes. It took her a moment to realize. She was free. The rope still gripped her hands together, blood-stained and soaking wet, but she was no longer hanging in the fishbowl in such a vulnerable position. In fact, she was curled up like a baby on the floor of the fishbowl, unharmed except for the injuries she'd inflicted on herself during her escape attempts. Abruptly, George's voice jarred her out of her daze. Sitting in an office chair right outside her fishbowl, he gestured across the room. "Look around," he told her. "What do you see?" Puzzled, Michelle glanced toward the other fishbowls, but they weren't there. No fishbowls or other women were in sight. She was completely alone in the monstrous warehouse. Michelle rose slowly to her feet, caught her balance, and began kicking and pounding at the glass sides. She tried climbing the sides with her bare hands. She pummeled the floor with her fists. "Let me out of here," she demanded in a threatening voice, breathing heavily. George snickered, then told her to calm down and listen carefully. "You have just been involved in one of my many experiments on human behavior. The other fishbowls and the women you watched die, they weren't real. Well, they were real experiments a few years ago. I projected holograms of their deaths to observe your reactions to them." George continued, "When it was your turn, I studied your reaction to your impending and violent death. But it was just water, Michelle. And of course, I would not let you drown in it." George laughed out loud, like this was some kind of joke. "However, you passed out of your own accord, and I had to drain the water quickly to save your life. It was probably your brain's way of protecting you, which is very interesting. It requires more study." Michelle spit out every degrading name she could think of, while George smiled at her patiently. Then he stood up and spoke with anticipation in his voice. "Make yourself comfortable, Michelle, but I'll be back. Then we will continue with more experiments. I have another dinner date." I hope you enjoyed this story. Please subscribe to my channel. Also, if you have a true story that is scary, creepy, or horrifying, which is well written, and you would like me to share, send the story to spinethrills@gmail.com.